U.S. has been at loggerheads with China in an intense trade battle that has spilled over into the technology sector. On May the 15th, the U.S. government blacklisted Huawei and its affiliates, placing them on the Bureau of Industry and Security Entity list. Soon after that, Google suspended Huawei's access to the Android operating system and apps. So how will the blockade from the U.S. side affect Huawei? What will the U.S. lose? And is the U.S. attacking of Huawei a serious mistake? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Charles Liu, founder of the Capital, How Capital, and Anna Tangen, current affairs commentator. We shall also speak to Steve King, honorary professor from the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security at University College London. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Gentlemen, the U.S. Department of Commerce has added Huawei and its 68 affiliates to the entity list. What does that mean when the BIS incorporates entities into the entity list? Charles.
Well, there are legal definitions to what this is, but it basically means for any company to do business with those on the list, they have to seek prior approval from the U.S. government, which basically means blocking business, because you can't sit around and wait for approvals all day.
What do you think of this measure of trade protectionism? Does it mean the death penalty for Huawei?
No, I don't think it does, but it's devolving the technical world. Whereas before, what you had was an environment where a global supply chain and knowledge was being exchanged freely. And now this is basically drawing the battle lines. And unfortunately, even in a post-Trump world, what you have here is businesses will be making investment decisions going forward, and there's very little chance that they'll be able to reverse those once they're in place.
Everybody was talking about whether this means the death penalty for Huawei, although very quickly a senior executive from Huawei said in a private letter to the employees that they have a backup plan. Now, having said that, on Monday, Charles, the U.S. Commerce Department announced that it would scale back restrictions on Huawei, issuing a 90-day temporary general license to Huawei in a bid to prevent the interruption of existing networks, operations, and equipment. What do you think of this measure by the U.S. government?
It's absolutely typical of this administration in the U.S. Do it first and then think about the consequences, like declaring Canada to be a national security risk, so the steel has to be tariffed. Now, in terms of this, a significant portion of rural America runs on Huawei equipment. If you blockade Huawei, who's going to service it? Where are the components going to come from? Replacements going to come from? Furthermore, most European countries and all of Southeast Asian countries run on Huawei infrastructure. Are you going to tell them, sorry, you can't use Huawei anymore? Is it going to be replaced overnight by Ericsson and Nokia equipment? This is the same thing in the UK. The infrastructure for the city, financial center of the UK, is Huawei equipment. Are you going to block that? If you can't service it, if you can't have replacement components, then the system fails. So they went ahead and declared blockade Huawei. Okay, without thinking about consequences.
Talking about the alternatives or plan B or a backup plan might be a luxury, but the United States seems to be known for lacking exit strategy after it had launched the invasion of Iraq. Well, that's a very interesting story about the U.S. Strategy for attacking an enemy. Let me go to Mr. Steve King, who's standing by in London. Now, Mr. King, are you surprised that it seems that the punishment is being rolled back a little bit with a 90-day temporary license?
Well, I think that, as your previous speaker said, America always attacks first and thinks about the consequences later. And this is a classic instance of that, because so much of the infrastructure already uses Huawei. And if you go about banning it, again, how do you service what exists? I mean, it is not amazing, because it is the I hate using the expression because it's saying it's a bull in a china shop. It's an American bull in a china shop doing the damage, and this is just typical.
Let me ask you one follow-up question, Steve. The U.S. firms account for 33 of Huawei's 92 global suppliers. How likely will Huawei survive if all of the U.S. firms cut off supplies? And what would be the consequences for American firms?
Well, we live in a web of industrial production these days. So much of what we use is something which is a supply chain that might have 20 companies and 10 countries involved in it. And of course telecommunications is the most extreme instance of that. So you simply can't take one piece out. It's like trying to remove a card from a stack of cards and expecting the entire stack of the house of cards to remain vertical. It won't. It'll all fall over. So it simply can't be done in the way that America is trying to do it.
And Google quickly suspended some businesses with Huawei in the wake of Trump's blacklist. Specifically, Huawei will soon lose access to updating Android's operating system and access to some popular services, including Google Play Store, Gmail, and YouTube apps, etc. What do you think of the consequences?
Well, this is actually more serious than the hardware stuff. I mean, quite frankly, Huawei buys $11 billion worth of goods from the U.S. From these companies, and that will be curtailed. But what you really have here with the software is unusual, because they're not going, if you have an existing Huawei phone or you buy it before the beginning of this 90-day period, you'll still be able to get updates, everything, you'll have access to everything. But after that, there'll be a real question. But, you know, Huawei has said that they had a backup plan in place for this. After the problems with ZTE had in the United States, there was a quiet move for this $100 billion a year company to start laying contingency plans, both for software and for hardware. Now, they have a system that they can operate. It sits on top of the existing open source Android, and it's probable that they do this. But the thing about this is that what you're doing is forcing Huawei, all right, and they're probably, therefore, a lot of other Chinese companies. Remember, 12 out of the top 15 companies that sell cell phones are, in fact, Chinese companies. They will probably adopt this. So you're going to have a schism, this hard fork between the American standards and what they believe they want others to do, and an open source standard that is being promoted by China. So it's a 180-degree reversal from what everybody likes to talk about, that it's China who's imposing anything. It'll be the U.S. who's doing it.
Well, let's take a closer look at the importance of operating systems, the operating platform for Huawei, the Android. I was told privately by a scientist that it's relatively easy to create an alternative operating platform in replacement of Android, but it's very, very difficult to create an ecology, an environment in which the operating platforms could easily attract partners and clients and users. Do you think this is the most difficult, the lethal killer?
I don't think so. There are short-term solutions and long-term solutions. The long-term solution is, of course, as Anna has said, you create a new ecosphere with your own operating system. And actually, Samsung already has one, locked up, just waiting for that day when maybe they can launch it. The short-term solution is there are software packages that can be had. Okay, new Huawei phone runs on an open source Android system, but there can be software packets that allows it to be just like the latest version of Android. And these will not be sold by Huawei, it could be sold by local countries. You know, if you're in Spain, you want to buy a Huawei phone, okay, for €3 more, you get a packet that allows it to run like any new Android from Samsung, for example. But creating the ecosphere is something that Google has done and Apple has done, and Apple has done it even more exceptionally well than Google. Because if you use an Apple computer, if you use an iPad, if you use an Apple Watch, then basically everything is linked together It's very difficult to break out of it. But in terms of the software you're talking about, it's not just the users, it's the software writers you have to attract to your ecosphere. They have to produce the applications that people want to use. So I think, you know, there are plenty of software writers in China that if Huawei started to develop its own ecosphere, there can be plenty of applications done.
Yeah, but in addition to that, since you're running it on top of Android, and you could either go the way of flashing the phone, which means you're literally putting a different operating system on there, so the phone doesn't know who built it. Okay, it's just a set of components. But the other thing is you can just simply use the existing apps that are available in the store by just simply saying the Huawei already has its own store group, by just simply saying you can just sign on. And remember, all of these groups want to sell their apps. And when you start talking about how large Huawei's market is, it's very hard to believe that they will pass up this opportunity. For instance, the same apps are available whether you're on Apple or on Android. So this would create a third one.
Let me go back to Steve King. We are talking about stripping Huawei of the Google operating system. How serious is that? Now, here is one allegation. Excuse me, Steve. Here is one allegation. Huawei could easily deliver a backup plan in terms of using a brand new operating system for the domestic users. However, outside China, people say it's more difficult if potential and current customers have been denied access to Google. What do you think of the sharp contrast?
Well, I think the problem with an operating system really comes down to how the developers interface with that system, and that's through the acronym is API, Application Programmer Interfaces, and they are already known for the current version of Android. If Google comes out with a new version where there are API hooks that aren't known to the current developers, it doesn't take long to work out what they are. So it is feasible to simply say we can reproduce the same basic functions. You need these arguments in your program to call this aspect of our operating system, and therefore you won't even know that you're not working with the Android operating system. So it's not difficult. It's not an insurmountable challenge. And I think it's certainly because Huawei's had plenty of warning that this sort of thing is coming, and they've got plenty of resources and, of course, a huge market. They'll be prepared. It might leave them 2 or 3 weeks behind the release of a new Google Android operating system to provide the same functionality and match the APIs so people can easily map their software from the Google environment across to what Huawei creates.
International observers point out that nationalist sentiments have been set ablaze in China after Huawei, after President Donald Trump announced that Huawei will be subject to the blacklist and the blockade. For example, Mr. Hu Xijin, editor-in-chief of Global Times, says in his Weibo that he would opt for the use of a Huawei and put aside iPhone. At the same time, he said in the same Weibo message, it doesn't mean he would boycott iPhone. He said if he were to boycott iPhone, he would have aroused anger from millions of fans of iPhones in the Chinese market. At the same time, it doesn't come as a surprise, does it, that Mr. Ren Zhengfei, founding chairman of Huawei, said some of his family members are still using iPhone. He calls for a reasonable rethinking about the relationship between Huawei and iPhone. He doesn't like the idea of nationalism. So what do you think of the voices from these two iconic figures for public opinions here?
I think what it all comes down to is it's not iPhone, it's not Huawei, it's not Huawei's Mate 30, P30 or Max that's coming out. It's a question the U.S. is trying to disrupt the global supply chain. iPhone, Huawei phones are all results of efficiency created by the modern supply chain, which is cored in China. And what the U.S. is doing is just bashing the supply chain without thinking of consequences. Will this supply chain go back to the U.S.? Will you be able to produce these phones in Wisconsin? No, it's not possible, because out of the 280-some components for the iPhone, for example, over 90% identifiable, traceable in terms of its location, location of production, is all in Asia. Will this go back? No, it's not going to go back to the U.S. I think what Mr. Ren is talking about is there is quite a bit for people to like about the iPhone. There's plenty for people to like. For example, CNET has just rated the Huawei phone to be the best camera phone there is, better than Samsung or Apple, the latest Apples. So it is the supply chain that created it. It's not China or US and so on. iPhone's made in China. Most of the components are from Asia, all of them actually. So what he's doing, what the Trump administration is doing, is bashing the supply chain in the hope of disrupting the whole thing. And some jobs may move back to the US, but jobs may move out of China, but they're still staying in Asia.
I know, what do you think of the self-deprecating manner and image of Mr. Ren Zhengfei, who allegedly keeps a distance from the government because he doesn't want to be viewed by Americans or Europeans as a very close beneficiary of the Chinese government subsidiary or help. Do you think this has been very helpful in somehow improving the image that Huawei is not just an arm of the Chinese government?
Well, unfortunately, the story is lost internationally. The press is, basically treats him as an agent provocateur of the Chinese government. So I think if people are watching and actually looking at what he's doing, it's a sharp contrast to, let us say, somebody like Donald Trump, who's lighting the fire. Here's a person who said, look, this is competition. Let's have more of it. Quite different from a kind of protectionist president who says, I want the jobs here, and there's no in between.
Steve, what do you think of the image of Ren Zhengfei in Europe?
Well, this is one more reason why Europe is looking towards Russia and China now rather than America, because the unreliability of America has gone through the roof under Donald Trump. It was bad enough beforehand. This is total chaos. So they'll obviously be affected by it because a large part of the infrastructure, as one of your other speakers said, in the UK is based on Huawei already. There's no way that they can say, well, let's not let it be maintained, let's ban it. Telecommunications is bad enough in the UK anyway without taking out 2/3 of the underlying infrastructure. So they're going to be saying, how the hell do we get around this? And they may well just hope that Huawei can develop its own operating system. The open source approach is the way to go. My feeling is the only way out of this is to propose something sensible back and say, if you're afraid about Huawei technology being used to spy, you're treating it like nuclear weapons. We have an independent authority to check and see whether anybody is breaking the constraints on nuclear weapon construction. Why not invent one of those to monitor not just Huawei, but also the Americans, who of course are equally liable to spy using this technology as the Chinese are, and take it out of the political sphere where Trump has landed it.
Let's look at the stock markets in China and elsewhere, in the United States, for example. Steve, the U.S. stocks fell on Monday in response to the White House restrictions on Huawei. How do you perceive the message from the stock market?
The Chinese stock market's a fairly heavy speculative element. How much the Shanghai market went up and down over the last few years. It'll cause a bit of chaos there, but I'm more concerned about what does it do to the investment levels than what it does to the valuation of the markets. And clearly this is going to force Huawei to be putting a large investment into developing its own operating system, to be building up its relationship with programmers throughout China. It may well lead to more private sector activity in China, which is the opposite of what Donald Trump is trying to cause.
Yeah.
For a long time, Charles and Anna, many have been scared by the volatility of the Chinese stock markets. But what do you think of the latest rebound of shares in the Chinese stock market? I mean, this is indeed a big surprise for many observers who follow the performance of the Chinese economy?
It's very, very difficult to say because there is so much retail investment, investors in China that go on the basis of rumors. And there have been some rumors the last couple of days about massive new funds to come into the Chinese market. So there was a big rebound today.
And what do you think of the reputation and the credibility of the stock market performance in China?
Well, the government's been has paid a lot of attention to that, but the fact is China's market is immature, and I mean that both in terms of the governance and transparency and things like that, but also in terms of the issue of having too many retail investors who, exactly as Charles said, they jump on a rumor, and the rumor spreads like wildfire, so you see these massive ups and downs. It would be more helpful if there were more institutional investors, Chinese institutions, who are a larger part of the market because they rely on ratings. People watch them carefully to see what they're doing. And that's the key. I mean, China has to mature its markets. It's going to happen. The question is, how long will it take?
Charles, Huawei announced recently that 2019 will be a year of a large-scale deployment of 5G around the world, and its carrier business has unprecedented opportunities for growth. By the end of March, Huawei had signed 40 commercial contracts for 5G with the leading global carriers. Question is, will the recent U.S. sanctions jeopardize or delay Huawei's global deployment of 5G?
I think the biggest issue is, it's not a question of whether or not it will delay it. It's uncertainty. Because we simply don't know what Mr. Trump would tweet next in terms of Huawei or in terms of the trade conflict. When you have global uncertainty, when you have policy uncertainty and trade uncertainty, then there are serious issues as to whether or not the investments are to be made in the rollout of 5G. Because basically or ultimately, for the operators, rolling out means spending money. And if you have uncertainty, you may have second thoughts about rolling out. But Huawei, there's no question that many countries, take for example the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, but basically most of the infrastructure is Huawei equipment. So to roll out 5G on the basis of, on top of the Huawei equipment is much easier. And the second part, which is really significant, is China's market size creates economies of scale, which Ericsson and Nokia simply don't have. So it's cheaper, faster rollout, more efficient, but uncertainty is going to throw a damper into this, unfortunately.
I see it a little bit differently. I agree with everything that you said about uncertainty and business not wanting to get involved. But there's also this issue of being first in the market. And China is 2 years ahead of the U.S. There's no question about that. China will, by 2020, have 1 million of these radios around the world. They have strong global partnerships, regional partnerships. They're going to continue to pursue that. And what is at stake here? Well, many of these countries can benefit from the efficiencies that having these types of systems involve. Because when you start getting down to the granular detail of what 5G enables in terms of real-time communication, it's amazing. Everything from retail to agriculture, municipal IoT, all of these things depend on it. And a lot of these countries need that. They don't have it, and they're not going to spend more and wait for the U.S. to come out with a system. Spending more and waiting is not the answer.
U.S. doesn't have a system, by the way. The other alternative really is Nokia and Ericsson.
Yeah.
But on your point, I'd just like to add, it is this incredibly efficient supply chain that created $50 cell phones for Africa, that created 1,000 stores, physical stores for Xiaomi in India. And this is what the Trump administration is trying to bash and destroy. And these efficiencies are benefiting the people all over the world. And breaking the supply chain means everything will be more expensive. And everything will be against efficiency going downward.
It's devolving, devolution. It's literally going to hurt everybody. This is not a game where anybody wins. It's simply everybody will lose. China, U.S., and the world.
Steve, what do you think of the response from European politicians like President Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel, as well as the Prime Minister May, when they are facing threats from the U.S. government that would cut off any exchange of intelligence reports about fighting terrorism as part of the commitments of the Five Eyes Alliance. Do you think European politicians would accept this bluff and yield to the pressure from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean on the issue of Huawei, particularly regarding 5G? We're going to agree?
They're in a very difficult situation. They're in a very difficult situation because publicly they have to agree with Trump, and that's what they're doing predominantly, but privately they know the disruption this will cause to their economies, and they've seen disruption everywhere coming from America right now, so they are, at the time through the back door, talking to China and Russia about ways of circumventing what the Americans are doing. This is applying in currencies as well as applying in telecommunications. So they know they have to free themselves from this unpredictable country, which of course is America, not China. So I have a feeling they'll mouth out, continue pushing what America is pushing. Ironically, that includes America's desire to have every company provide a back door for Americans to spy on what those companies are doing through what's called the Five Eyes network, which Australia has already signed up to. And after the most recent election, which went to the Conservatives in power rather than to the Labor, it's likely to cement that rule. So meaning it's Australian companies are required to spy on behalf of the American spy agency, which shares information with America. It makes this whole thing about America complaining about China spying on the rest of the world quite a comical joke. And I'm sure the authorities in the UK and in Europe are quite aware of that themselves. So while they can't step out of line with the utterances of the Five Eyes Alliance of which they're part, I'm sure behind the scenes they're doing the best they can to circumvent that, and that will mean being cooperative with China rather than being trying to exclude them.
I think there's a very good example that happened today. The European Union inked 2 agreements with the Chinese Civil Aviation Authority to standardize their equipment and training and all of these things. So while you see the U.S. one day pulling away from China, you see the European Union the next day getting closer.
The worst case scenario, Charles, would be whether the U.S. government is ready to cut off all the financial support, like allowing China to use SWIFT in the settlement of the global business transactions. Will the tech war spill over into the financial war, and that will be a nasty domino reaction. That will be the end of the world, perhaps, for China.
It's not the end of the world for China. It's the end of the world, period. Because you're looking at China being the principal trading partner of 120-some countries and regions. U.S. maybe about 40. And to put an iron curtain around China, as the U.S. is trying to do, is just inconceivable, because other countries have to survive. They have to live. They have to trade. They live on trading. They live as part of the supply chain. How can you break it? You can't. It will cause global uproar.
Well, you can have attempts, and there is some speculation that Donald Trump is using this issue to, let us say, divert the conversation in Washington away from some of his problems, and also as part of his kind of full pressure response to trying to get the trade deal that he thinks he wants for America.
Today, many people start talking about the important position of George Kennan, who drafted a letter X to describe the nasty nature of the Soviet Empire, and that was viewed as the beginning of the Cold War. I wonder if this letter X would be quickly issued by the State Department of the U.S. government. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.